So, to understand the completed model of the human species, the most important thing is to understand the primary disorder that is present and has been present for quite a while. Um, uh, and that is simply that we are not regulating ourselves well since we've stopped being a natural system. Inside a natural system, we were required to regulate ourselves within certain parameters, and which I've discussed in the previous video. But since that stopped, we're no longer a natural system and regulated by those parameters. About 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, it stopped. And again, the reason for that I've explained in the previous video. So that's the primary disorder in the model, in the completed model. And of course, that's a very nice heuristic, helpful way to understand what it is. But we'll get into it in much more detail as to how that functions and the dynamics of that and all that. And get into it in much more complexity, really, and which is kind of fun if you like modeling. And there's lots of interesting linguistic ways of describing it, and there's just really some nice, interesting logical models of describing the primary disorder. But anyway, so that's the primary disorder, and the secondary disorders then kind of come from that. So in natural systems, let's just think about what diet is. It's a mechanism through which natural selection operates. Sex, territory, physiological disease, and so on. And it's a bit interesting, but organizational disease is also, just like physiological disease operates in natural systems, there's a thing called organizational disease, which operates in natural systems to test them that's how natural selection works. Those are the mechanisms through which it does its job. And an important principle of that is to realize that these mechanisms are not random. They are themselves evolved through natural selection. So these are refined mechanisms of doing what happens in them. So that's just 5 of them I've mentioned there. But the problem is when we stop being a natural system, these mechanisms still existed in our species, but they were no longer really regulated, and they were just kind of became very disorderly and created quite a mess. And we'll talk about how we handle that mess in a minute. We'll get to that at the end of the video. But so these are I just call them the secondary disorders. And when we learn to regulate these things well for our well-being and all that stuff and sort them out, which we must do, then they wouldn't be disorders anymore. They would just be aspects of remnants of natural selection that we are managing well. Of course, to say they're remnants of natural selection is just to look at it from this perspective. Obviously, they're part of the human experience, and there's more complexity to that. So there's other perspectives on these things as well. But from this perspective, it's important to realize that's why they are so problematic, and we do need to take responsibility to regulate them in a suitable manner for everybody's welfare and well-being. And everybody's welfare and well-being is very important. And that word "everybody" is very important because that relates to the primary disorder and how it operates and some other things. But anyway, we'll come back to that later on in the modeling. So that's the thing which we need to do. Also, some other things that are regulated is food, population, and tribalism would be aspects of natural systems that are regulated, that we must now learn to regulate ourselves, individually, collectively, as societies, as a world. We just got to figure out how we want to kind of organize around these things so that everybody's welfare and well-being is looked after. And of course, we've got to appreciate just as disease, physiological disease is ever present, and we must, come up with some sensible ways to manage that. Organizational disease, which is quite a vicious disease, is also always present, ever present, and we must put things in place to address that as well and understand it and so on. Again, I'll come back to one very beautiful thing is that while we were a natural system, we created well-being and welfare for our individually, families, tribes of tribes, species, ecology, because that was a requirement in order for survival. There's a huge pressure to do that. And obviously, a pressure, if we didn't do that, there was a deselection pressure. Because natural selection doesn't look at things the way we do, it just sees the whole system interconnected. It doesn't divide it up the way we look at it. But so what I mean there is that well-being we have the capacity to create well-being. We have the capacity to figure out how to regulate these things, and how to address physiological and organizational disease and regulate sexuality and territory and diet and address food, population and tribalism and all that in sensible and good ways that kind of work. And I've got a couple of ideas, of course, that I'd like to contribute to that conversation. We have the ability to do this, our intelligence, our inspiration, our ability to consult, and not just, our collective intelligence, our ability to look at these things together, and come up with ideas. And our ability, one of the most important things that we need to develop is our ability to measure progress, whether we're getting closer or further away from that. I think that is one of the most important things to do, and there's certain ideas about how to do that, maybe. This is kind of, when you become aware of this, and we're aware of the completed model, it's wonderful because we can apply our minds and our capacities to this challenge individually, but we can also collectively be consciously aware of this together and collaborate and work on this, which is a wonderful, meaningful, good, purposeful, kind of connected sense of belonging and connection as we embrace this purpose together, which is really wonderful. It connects us, unifies us, brings harmony and focus to us collectively, and also doing this thing in a way protects us. It's one of the many ways, and there has to be many ways to protect us against the ever-present organizational disease that is one of the mechanisms of natural selection that's just gone quite crazy since the invention of agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution, which I explained in the previous video as to why we're kind of in this situation. For example, if you think of how physiological disease can just get out of control and terrible things can happen if we don't manage it. Well, the same thing with organizational disease. It just needs to be understood and addressed. And there's lots of things we can put in place to address it, like, for example, transparency, accountability, feedback, integrity, intellectual and moral courage, and so just to mention a few, there's lots of things you do to address physiological disease, and measuring progress, of course, is another one. But anyway, lots of things we can put in place there. But it opens up that discussion for us to work on it together. So that's kind of covering the primary disorder, the secondary disorder, and in the model also I get into, so in natural systems there is a process that creates the form of the natural system. It's called natural selection. And that is the kind of governing process that's going around constantly developing the form of the system. Whether that's the anatomy of a tiger, the psychology, the mental, awareness and cognition of a giraffe, or the interrelationship between predator and prey, the herds or species, or how interspecies relate, or how different herds of species relate, or ecology. All that stuff there's one process going around looking at it, and that process looks at it as one whole system. It's not like sometimes we look at it and kind of humanize it, or what's the word, and anthropomorphize. I'm not sure, but anyway, that's the process there. So similarly, that used to be the process that was kind of governing, checking our form and how we exist in it. It has certain pressures. As I said, it has a certain pressure for creating systems that are healthy and well exclusively. It doesn't tolerate anything else, because if you're not healthy and well, natural selection doesn't create those kind of systems. Obviously. I'll probably explain that a little bit later down in the model when I get into breaking things down a bit more, because I'm just introducing stuff now, and then as we get deeper into the model, we break things down more. This is just kind of the big picture, the completed model, if you will. It's kind of understanding everything. It's like as if I was to explain to you, let me give you a kind of completed model of a human body. I'd say you got bones and skin, organs kind of do this stuff, the heart does this, the lungs do this, the brain does this, with your eyes. And I could just roughly kind of explain, that the heart pumps the blood around, the lungs get the oxygen into the blood, and the whole kind of, so you would have a general basic understanding of how the whole system works, which I think most people do, and that's important. But then, of course, each of these systems you can break down into almost endless complexity. So what the completed model is, it just gives us the total model of what's happening to the human species. And then, of course, we endless complexity in exploring and investigating all the different aspects of it. which I do to some degree, but there's obviously a huge amount of work to explore and understand lots of aspects of it. But it really helps to have the full picture of how the whole thing is connected and how it works. If you're working from there, it's a lot more fun maybe to explore it. So let's talk about now what process is governing the human species now. For example, some people talk about this question, who's ruling the world? And it's a fair question because some people and stuff have more power and influence and all this stuff. It's a lot of forces, but it's actually not really what's happening. There's a process governing the dynamics of the species now that is creating its form. It's what is this process is really a more helpful question. That's why the other question is so hard to answer, because it's kind of the wrong question, you know? It's a good question. It's getting at the right thing to find out, but it's just asking it the wrong way. It's kind of impossible to answer. So what is the process? And again, I'll get it on the most simplest level to understand this process, and I get into it in more complexity as I develop the model. But there are two forces. So since we came out of natural systems and the primary disorder developed, we can simply say that the human species became very self-destructive in multiple ways, multiple ways. I don't really need to go, obviously, so every one of the secondary disorders became a source of destruction, and food, population, tribalism, diet, territory, sex, physiological disease, they're just some of the. But it's not just any kind of destruction. What it is actually, it's a destruction that feeds on itself. Like the more of it that's going on, the more of it that it will encourage to go on. So that is a reinforcing feedback loop of self-destructiveness is occurring in our species, which if left unchecked would obliterate the whole species, right? But it's not left unchecked, because in response to this feedback loop or reinforcing feedback loop of self-destruction, there's another a feedback loop that's called a balancing feedback loop. So when things get too out of hand, something happens to try and rein it back in, to try and put some boundaries around it, to put some kind of some systems in place so that this doesn't get so crazy again, and we can think of lots of examples of that, trying to rein it in. Something terrible happened. I mean, a very blatant, obvious, simple example of this is maybe World War II. It was absolutely horrific. And everybody said, we need to be more united and connected. We need to put some structures in place so this never happens again. That's an example of a reinforcing feedback loop of self-destructiveness that happened. And we can just see it all the time, all over the world, throughout history. But there is an interesting thing. So that is causality. So when we understand the causality of these feedback loops is the primary disorder, and also the secondary disorders not being addressed, but primarily the primary disorder not being addressed is the cause. And then you see, that's the cause of all this trouble. But the interesting thing about feedback loops is that if you look at any particular string of events and stuff that goes on, it seems to go on forever, because you're just following a feedback. It's not a linear thing. So from the primary disorder to the feedback loops is a linear causality. But when you look at the feedback loops themselves, it just seems to be endlessly complicated and going on and one thing happening, because it is a feedback loop. And people are intelligent and creative and technology develops. So it's a very complex, dynamic feedback loop. And also multiple interconnections of things, like everything is affecting lots of other things. So that's why causality can be quite overdetermined when we look at these feedback, because sometimes we can see obviously certain linear patterns, but then you can say, well, what happened before that and what other factors were connected to that and so on. So that there is that degree of, but of course within feedback loops we can certainly see linear patterns. If somebody was to kill somebody else, we can quite clearly see the causality of that as one person shooting somebody else, and that's a linear causality. But then you look into all the factors as to what led up to that and how it went on. It starts getting quite complex. In natural systems, being psychologically well and culturally well is absolutely essential if you want to have a chance at surviving, if you want to be in the game. So that's how we evolved to be well. And for human well-being is interesting because of course the paradox is that natural systems are actually quite difficult, or can be at certain times. So therefore we developed a kind of well-being that is capable of persisting through difficulty, and actually in a way flourishing through difficulty is through hardship and struggle. That's when we need to shine, because that's to stay alive. That's when you need to shine most. And so on. Of course, our this well-being is always challenged by organizational disease, to see if we just like our physical bodies are challenged by physical disease, to see if they were worth staying in the system. Same, that happened back then. So quite a lot covered today. Primary disorder, secondary disorders, this process that I talked about that's governing the human species now, sort of covered that, talked a little bit about the feedback nature of the whole thing, and touched on a lot of interesting things in the completed model. So I hope you're enjoying this journey. This is the second video. And I'm not quite sure what I'm going to cover in the third video, but I'll have a think about it, and I'll try and keep it interesting and accessible and exciting. And hopefully we're on this journey through these videos of getting to a new consciousness across the world as a human species, that we become self-aware as a human species. And in that consciousness, we can live new lives, aware of it and respond to it with our intelligence and capacity. And we can also live new collective lives, community lives together, because we're all aware of it now. We can just work on it together. So it's a journey of changing our consciousness by understanding completed model. And from that place of consciousness, we can embrace new behaviors, and new collectively how we connect can change, because we have this wonderful new emerging world enveloping insight into becoming self-aware of what's happened to us and is happening us as humanity, as people of the world, as the human species.